Thank you for joining us for The Light Side of Photography, a photography workshop with David Hayden. I'm Megan Wilbar, Museum Coordinator for the InfoZone Museum. During the months of January and February, the InfoZone Museum is having an exhibition featuring the films, life, and work of photographer Frank Muramoto. In conjunction with the exhibition, we are fortunate to have David Hayden with us today to shed light on how to improve our own photography at any level. We have his pre-recorded workshop, and he's also joining us live to answer questions at the end. So please type your questions and comments into the chat box, and we'll see you after the show.
Hello. Light is really everything in photography. In fact, the word photography means light drawing. It's a combination of photo, light, and graphique, drawing, so light drawing. And as photographers, if we really want to improve our photography and move to the next level, we really need to understand the principles of light and how they affect our subject, and how we can use the natural available light, studio lights, or any other kind of portable light or reflector to bring the light to our subject in such a way that it really enhances the subject and makes it stand out so that we can have some incredible photographs. Let's expand on this subject just a little bit. If you have no light, just no light at all, it really doesn't matter what your subject is. You won't see it, will you? But on the other hand, if you have way too much light, you'll wash everything out and you still won't be able to see your subject. So without the proper light, the subject really doesn't matter. But if you get the light right and adjusted for your subject, then you can come up with some pretty decent images. But it all starts with the light. So you can see why I hold such a strong opinion that understanding light is one of the most important things that we as photographers can do to really make our picture stand out. The image on the left is dark, the image on the right is light, and that's fine because the light is appropriate for the subject matter. And what's really fun about this is while the image on the right was actually done with a more expensive studio light, the image on the left, the peach, was done with a simple flashlight. So you don't have to spend a whole lot of money to get the pictures you want, but what you do have to do is you have to understand light so you can use the lighting tools you have available to you to enhance your subject and really make it pop out from the photograph. In case you're wondering, who is this madman and does he really have anything to teach me about photography? Let me tell you a little bit about my background. I got my first camera in 1965. I've been shooting pictures ever since. It's a passion for me. I really love it. But in spite of that long history, I still push myself to continue to learn wherever I can. Most recently, I've been studying the programs offered by Don Giannatti, Joel Sartori, Joe McNally, Roberto Valenzuela. These are all profoundly good professional photographers. Not only are brilliant at what they do, but they're also very good teachers. So over the course of this program, I'd like to share with you some of the things I've learned from them and kind of condense it and distill it down into an hour program instead of 60 or 70 hours of study. Before we get too far involved in this program, I need to offer this disclaimer. Everything I say are my own opinions, not those of the library, Pueblo West Photography, the Southern Colorado Photography Society, or anyone else in the world. They're just my opinions. And everything I'm about to tell you is probably wrong. Just ask the internet. You can go on the internet and people will say, well, design is most important, depth of field is most important, use of color is most important, black and white. It doesn't matter. The thing is, everything you learn about photography is going to improve your photography. So that's where we want to go from here. Okay, let's get started. As mentioned before, the thesis of this program is it helps to understand light. And the good news is that all light behaves the same way. Doesn't matter whether it's sunlight or light coming from household lamps, flash, video lights, studio lights, or even from the moon. The principles of light apply to all forms of light, and all light uh, behaves in the same and predictable ways, and that makes our job as photographers much easier. We just have to learn a few basic principles. Light does many things and has lots of properties. Fortunately for photographers, just knowing a few of them can make all the difference and can give us the ability to turn our would-be snapshots into stunning photographs. Now, for the remainder of this program, we will be reviewing what I believe to be the four most important behaviors of light, and they are starting with probably the easiest to understand, the angle of light, and that all light has a direction and reflects in predictable ways, the color of the light and how that affects our images, the size of the light source relative to the subject, and the huge difference that makes on how the subject presentation, and finally the intensity of light versus the distance of the light to the subject, how it falls off very predictably so you can adjust your light to get the foreground and the background to really contrast and make your subject stand out. The angle of light hitting our subject is probably the easiest thing to notice. We simply look at the shadows and instinctively know where the light is coming from. Now, with that awareness, we know that by moving the light or moving the subject, we can control what is bright and what is in shadow. It is obvious to us that the light travels in straight lines, but it's also important to know that light does not travel in parallel lines. Light spreads out from the source much like a slice of pie spreads out from the center. This is one of the reasons the illumination of our subject weakens as the light source moves away, something we'll be discussing later. But although light rays do not travel in parallel lines, they do travel in straight lines, and they also reflect in straight lines, and this is very useful to photographers. You might have had a science class in school and maybe saw a graphic similar to this one where you heard a discussion about the angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection. This simple principle applies to many things. It's like playing pool. The angle your cue ball approaches the side rail is the same angle it bounces away from the side rail. So how is this useful to us? Well, imagine you're shooting a shiny object, maybe a picture on a wall that has glass on the front of it, or a fish in an aquarium. If you use a flash mounted on your camera, you'll probably just get a bright glare where your subject ought to be. But by knowing the angle of approach is going to equal the angle of departure, you can easily figure out where to place your light so it lights the subject but does not directly bounce back into the lens. Or in another situation, maybe you have a dark shadow and you'd like to soften the shadow, but you have no additional lights. By knowing how light reflects, you can place a reflector, maybe a white card or even a sheet of cloth, anything, a colored card if you want to throw color in the shadow, whatever. Anyway, you can place a reflector such that the angle of light hitting it reflects directly in the shadow you want to soften. Then by slightly adjusting the card or your reflector, you can control the strength of the reflection and the degree to which you fill that shadow. When we talk about light and reflecting light, I like to think of the concept of reflective efficiency. I don't know if that's the officially correct term, but that's how I think about it in my mind. And when you think about reflecting light, both the surface of our subject and the surface of our reflectors matter. Shiny surfaces have a more angular efficiency and they show or create specular reflections, as you can see in the picture down in the lower left. Rough or smooth or textured surfaces that aren't shiny tend to diffuse the light being reflected, and that results in a softer light but with significant reduction. Let's watch this short little video I created. As you can see, as I move the laser around, you can see the specular highlights on the right-hand side, but as I move the light onto the paper, the reflection that goes onto the paper itself becomes very diffuse. It started out, of course, very specular and clear. You can see the line right here. That's a very sharp reflection because the stainless steel backing is a very efficient reflector. The paper is a much less efficient reflector, and you can see how even though the light is very close to the back piece of paper, that normally point source of light, the laser itself has been diffused, and now it's just kind of a broad red light, but it's also a whole lot dimmer. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. When I set up this picture, I wanted the light to accentuate the cheesecake, but I didn't want harsh shadows under the plate or silverware. I wanted just enough shadow to give dimension to the subject, but not so much as to distract the viewer's eye. So once I had the key light set up, I then adjusted a white card to reflect light in a way to soften the shadows under the plate. You can see here actually the white card reflected light to the bottom of the plate, which then reflected light back into the shadow. So it really kind of softened that shadow. But this effect can work against you as well. Imagine you're shooting a portrait in a park. Your subject is sitting on the grass, looking comfortable, happy, relaxed. You seize the moment and take the shot. Remember, the light is bouncing off of green grass. So what you're probably going to find out when you go to print or edit the photo is that the model and their outfit and everything close to the grass has a green tint to it. There'll probably be more green closer to the grass than it is farther away from it. And this creates kind of a problem because when you go to print or edit the photo, if you adjust it in such a way as to take the green tint off of the subject, then it throws the color cast of the background out. It becomes a little more red and unnatural. Well, your remedy for this is to spread out a white cloth or have a white reflector out in front of the model to fill the shadows, but you keep it out of the frame so it's not in the picture, of course. And by doing that, you can soften those shadows, remove the unattractive shadows that might appear under the nose or in the eye sockets and so on, and do it in a way that you do not get a green cast. While we're on the subject of color, clearly the color of light affects our photographs. There's no secret there. But it gets a little more involved. The visible light spectrum we can see is made up of millions of colors ranging from infrared to ultraviolet. These three images show the combination of colors that give us white light. The picture on the left shows some LED Christmas lights viewed through a diffraction gradient, and you can see that these particular LEDs pretty much show or contain the entire spectrum of light. The inset rainbow is just what sunlight looks like once it's passed through a prism. And finally, the toy on the plastic spoon is lit with white light, but the light passing through the spoon is split into a range of colors through sort of a prismatic effect. When we look at something that appears white, that is because the object is reflecting most of the spectrum of the light that's hitting it. When something appears green, for example, as the parsley in the lower half of the slide, that's because the object, in this case the parsley, absorbed all of the colors of light except those in the sort of greenish yellow spectrum. Now look at the picture in the upper right-hand corner. That is actually a green plant with a reddish flower, but the light shining on the flower is only red and blue. There is no green in the light source that's shining on the flower. As a result, we see the red flower, and most of the green leaves appear black because there is no green to reflect. Now we do get a little bit of reddish purplish reflection off the leaves, but that's due to the shine on the leaves, not because the leaves themselves aren't green or don't absorb in that particular range. The color of light is quite obvious when we're viewing photographs, but it's not quite so obvious when we're taking them. We have some pretty magnificent brains, and when we walk into a room that maybe is lit with incandescent lights, we barely even notice yellow tint or yellow cast that's on all the objects around us. We just naturally convert them to the colors our brains expect to see. And then maybe we move from that room into one that's been lit with fluorescent lights, which is often has a green cast to it. Again, our brains just very quickly adjust and everything looks kind of normal. Cameras, not so much. They see the light that's there and they return the light that's there. Now they do have some white balancing and they can white balance for whatever the bulk of the light is. But if you're in a room that has mixed light, maybe fluorescence overhead uh, or fluorescence overhead combined with incandescence from the side, maybe a lamp off the side or something like that, then we have a lot of trouble making that image look the way we want because we're fighting the color cast of the different light sources. There may be times when you want to use that to your benefit, but if you're not intending to do that, it can be a real frustration. So pay attention to the color of the light that you're shooting, and also if you need to add lights to enhance the light, you want the light to, typically you want it to light the ambient light so that it looks more natural. You take a small LED flashlight and you shine it on something that's been lit with incandescent light, everything around the object's going to look pretty yellow and the object's going to have kind of a bluish cast from the LED light. So that's just something to pay attention to, and you'll notice it a lot when you look at pictures. Okay, this slide might look really complicated, but it's not. The insets in this area here, this is just shows the light sensitivity of our eyes. You know, how sensitive are our eyes to different colors in the spectrum. This little chart here shows warm LEDs, the spectrum you get from a warm LED or a color tuned LED or a daylight or a cool light or a warm light. So you can see how the spectrum changes just from the light source. But how that affects our photography is then shown in these pictures here. Now, this upper left picture, the camera has set to a daylight white balance, and the light actually illuminating the color chart is a filtered daylight, and there's a little bit of reflection off kind of beige walls. But you can see you check the white here with the white of the background of the slide, that's pretty white light. Then we move over to this right-hand picture here, and for this picture, I didn't change anything except I added a little bit of colored light from just some warm LEDs that hang in my studio. When I turned those warm LEDs on, they started casting that sort of warm glow that you see on the picture, and it changed. So now we've got mixed light, and the colors are starting to get confused, like I was talking about. The lower left picture down here, now this is just the color chart with only an incandescent light shining on it. I used an incandescent studio light, and that's the only thing that changed, and you can see how yellow those colors got. Like I said, if we walked into that room and our eyes adjusted, we wouldn't realize we're looking at something that's tinted that yellow typically. But that's what happens. And then finally, in this right-hand picture, I used what's considered a white balance studio LED light. And you can see it's very close to the daylight up on top. However, it's a little slightly warmer here, and I think that's just because of some reflections. I was actually standing pretty close to this wearing a yellow sweatshirt, which probably threw on a yellow cast. All those things affect the color spectrums in our pictures and what the camera picks up, and ultimately what our viewers or we see when we look at our photographs. No discussion of color and photography complete without some discussion about how cameras white balance images. They have a number of settings. You can set it to auto white balance or daylight, fluorescent, incandescent, whatever. But it does a specific thing in auto white balance that you really need to be aware of. Now, some people say cameras are really pretty smart, I personally don't ascribe to that notion. I think cameras do a lot of things, but they cannot anticipate the photographer's intent. And the way they evaluate things is generalized. They don't know specifically what's going on. For example, if you look at these two pictures of the pumpkin on the left, notice how it's kind of very blue, has a bluish cast all around, while the pumpkins on the right have a more normal color cast. The pumpkins on the left were shot with the camera in auto white balance. Auto white balance tells the camera, look at all the colors in the image, kind of figure out what's there and try and balance it. The camera saw all that orange from the pumpkins and the leaves and said, well, this picture is really too warm. I need to cool it down. Hence you get all that blue, the blue cast on the pumpkins and the blue cast on the glassware and so on behind. That's not what I wanted. I wanted the pumpkins to look realistic to the color that they actually are. So because I was using window light, I set the camera to daylight color balance. So then it's preset for daylight, and then I just took the exact same image and notice how the colors are more representative. The pumpkins are orange, the glassware has a slight blue tint, which actually is the case, but the pumpkins are orange and the table is a nice warm color, doesn't have the greenish cast and so on that you see in the left-hand picture. Now, if you're shooting raw images, which is a type of image that has all the detail in it, you can undo what the camera has done. If you're shooting JPEG files, a lot of times that's a lot harder because the JPEG files subtract information out of the image. And if they subtract too much of the color information out, it doesn't leave you enough latitude to adjust the picture back to the original colors that you really wanted them to be. Just something to keep in mind. But the important thing here is auto white balance looks for a preponderance of color and then decides whether or not that balance is correct. So if you're shooting things with strong colors, like in this case pumpkins, where it's really warm, it's going to cool the whole picture down. If I was shooting something really cool, a bowl of water or something, I don't know, or blue bowls, it's going to try and warm the picture up because it thinks the image is too cool and needs to be warmed up. So in cases like that where you have strong color into your subject, a lot of times you need to take control of that white balance. There's a number of ways to do that that go beyond this particular workshop, but you can use gray cards, you can manually set the color of the light in your camera and so on. But just be aware auto white balance is not always your friend. You hear photographers talk a lot about hard light and soft light. But what does that really mean and how do we control it? Hard light is easy to identify by looking at shadows. The more well-defined the edges of the shadows, the harder the light. As the edges of the shadows lose definition, that indicates the light is getting softer. Hard light is a direct result of the light source being relatively small with respect to the subject. In this slide, notice the distinct shadows of the key and the posts of the picnic table. In the case of the key, I used a small flashlight that is fairly close to the key that's suspended over the sheet music, and that gave us those hard shadows, nearly a perfect silhouette of the key. The shadows around the picnic table are hard because the sun, although it's huge, is millions of miles away, making it a relatively small light source with respect to the subject. Here's an example from my studio. The subject is a tripod head on a small cookie can. Notice in the top image, the light source is quite small with relationship to the subject, and consequently, the light is very hard, as witnessed by the sharp shadows. In the lower image, I used the exact same light, but I added a large softbox. Now see how soft the shadows are? But there was a consequence. Since the light is spread out, there are less photons or less light rays actually hitting the subject. As a result, I had to increase the exposure by 2 stops because by spreading the light out and making it soft, I actually reduced the direct light on the subject by 75%. Hard light and soft light are both very important in creating great photographs. Hard light has the advantage of bringing out textures, as you can see as the image on the left. It is also a favorite of, or often a favorite of black and white photographers where detail and texture is sometimes more important than the subject itself. But if it's not wanted, the hard shadows, like you see in the picture on the right of the shadows of the tree on the road, that can be really distracting and will muddy up an otherwise good picture. Notice how soft the light is in these two images. The soft light in the left picture removes the complication that would be caused by harsh shadows. Those would be shadows around the corn, the kernels of corn, and the peppers and so on. Harsh shadows would really complicate that picture. But notice also how the soft light of the mannequin head provides just enough shadow to define the shape, but not so much that it detracts from the face. Soft light is often preferred for portraiture, specifically when photographing women and children. Hard light, however, is also used by a lot of photographers for portraits, specifically when they want to create a kind of hard, edgy look. And for men, that could mean like strong, defined features and masculine jaw lines and so on like that. Let's look back at a previous image. The shadows indicate hard light, but also notice the shadow is not extremely dark. It's well defined, but it's not black. The reason for that is because of two things. Number one, the distance of the light from the subject, or the distance of the light to the subject. And number two, the distance from the subject to the backdrop, which by extension implies the distance from the backdrop to the light source as well. So it's important not to confuse hard light with harsh, dark shadows. And this brings us to the subject of light fall off. We all know the farther the light is from a subject, the more dim the light becomes. And we observe this all the time when we're driving or riding in a car at night. Closer objects appear brighter. But the illumination does not fall off in a straight line. Like if we go double the distance from the light, we don't lose half the light, we actually lose 75%. Take a look at this diagram from elixxier.com, and it really shows how quickly illumination drops off with distance. And let's look at the shape of this curve. At our first subject, we have 100% light, so we're perfectly exposed. The time we double the distance, we go from 1 meter to 2 meter, we're actually down to 25% light. We've lost 75% light. But then we have to double the distance again and go way over here. And when we do that, we still only lose another 75% of what we had. And then we come way out here to the end, out at 6 meters. And at this point, we've lost all but 2.78% of our light. So the closer you are to the light, the more quickly the light falls off. The farther you get from the light source, the more slowly it falls off. Here again is an example from my studio. In the upper left image, the light is 2 inches from the first disc, 4 inches from the second disc, and 8 inches from the third disc. From 2 to 4 inches, we lost 75% or 2 stops of light. But then we had to go yet another 4 inches to get out to 8 inches before we lost another 75% or 2 stops. Well, this aspect of light is consistent regardless of distance. Look at the lower photograph. Here I started with the light at 16 inches away from the first disc, 32 inches away from the second disc, and 64 inches away from the third disc. See, the loss of illumination follows the same curve. Double the distance from 16 inches to 32 inches, lose 75%. From 32 inches to 64 inches, illumination again drops off another 75%. But we'd have to go all the way out to 128 inches to lose another 75%. The farther away the light is from the source, the more gradual the fall off. So without getting all geeky on you, you just learned what is known as the inverse square law of light, which says that the intensity of light is inversely proportional to the square of the distance. So when you hear people talking about the inverse square law, you now know what they're talking about. Okay, fine. The light falls off predictably. So what? How is that useful to us as photographers? Well, I think these two images might give you an idea of how light fall off can be used to create the effects you want in your photographs. These images are basically the same in that the camera and subject do not change other than the exposure settings and the backdrop. In one case, I used the white backdrop. In the other case, I used a black backdrop. Now, the feather on the left is very close to the white background, and the light is very far away, so I can minimize the fall off between the light, the subject, and the background. The feather on the right, however, is just the opposite in the following respects. The background is black, which if the light is too close to it, would actually appear gray instead of dark black. But I did change the background. It is a black background. The feather is quite a bit farther from the black background so that I can take advantage of the light fall off. And the light is very close to the feather, again, so the light falls off very quickly before it gets to the black background. In both images, the light source is fairly big, so it's not too hard when compared to the feather. So you can see that by how you position the light with respect to the subject, it can have a huge difference in the impact of the photograph. Now, if you're working outside, doing portrait work outside, you want your subject to pop out from the background, a lot of times you'll have to bring a reflector or another light, a flash or something like that, that'll overpower the background so you can illuminate your subject for the photograph, but the background, because of the light, will fall off a little bit and be a little darker. But that's a whole different thing when you start talking portrait photography. That's a whole different can of worms, and we're not going there completely today. It's just a suggestion. Like I say, you could use reflectors or a big light softbox, depending on if you wanted soft light, or a regular flash if you wanted hard light off the flash, and so on. Okay, we have covered a lot in the last half hour. So let's review a little bit of what we've covered. First of all, we covered why light and controlling light is so important to photography. And to me, it's the most important thing in photography. If you have too much light, you have no subject at all. Or if you have too little light, you have no subject at all. So the light must be just right and appropriate for the subject for us to have a good photograph. We also covered that it helps to understand light, and that the good news is that all light behaves the same way. And it doesn't matter whether you're working with sunlight or you're dealing with local incandescent lights or fluorescent lights on a lampstand or the moon or any of these photographic lights. It doesn't matter. The light output is going to behave the same way, regardless of whatever your source is. The first thing we talked about was how the angle of light matters. That's probably the easiest thing to see when we look at a photograph. We look at it quickly and we can pretty much tell where the light's coming from. Let's look at a couple of images here and see how I use the angle of light to enhance my photographs. Now the picture on the left, that brick wall and this window and right up to about here, in this area here, is all a backdrop I have hanging on the wall. So I put this can of apples and so on in front of the backdrop, added my own flooring that I have that matches that backdrop, and I shot the image. Now to make the image look congruent and consistent, I had to match the angle of light hitting my apples to pretty much of the perceived angle of light coming in on the backdrop. And you can see from the highlight here that the angle of light is pretty much coming from the same direction of where those windows would be if they were out there farther. Also, you notice the shadows are kind of going off this way, and where you can see where I'm a little off in my angle here because my shadows from the can are more off to the side and probably should be a little off more to that direction. But by controlling the angle of light, I was able to highlight the part of the can I want to give it some shape and dimension, and also for the apples. You can also tell that the light is fairly far away. Look how slowly the light falls off from the true value down in the shadow. That tells us what? That tells us the light was fairly far away. And we can also see the shadows are down here. They're pretty distinct, pretty hard edges, so that we know the light is relatively close to the subject, or I'm sorry, that the light source is fairly small compared to the subject, which gives us the harsher shadows. Now, if we look over at this picture over here, we can see how distinct those shadows are. So we know that the light is very small with respect to the two vases, but we can also tell from the angle. I used an angle of light that's kind of low and a little bit behind to cast these long shadows to give some interest to the subject, but also to bring out the texture of the little lizards or iguanas or whatever on the vases. By using the angle of light and also the way I set up the vases, I can make those iguanas pop out, so you really get that that's a 3D relief on those particular vases. We talked about how the color of light matters. In this particular case, particularly on the left-hand side, I wanted the drop of milk to have some complementary colors. So the base illumination I actually used was with two lights. I used an orange light and a blue light. Now, orange and blue are complementary colors, so when you put them together, you get kind of a white light. Hence, you see the white in the areas where the blue light and the orange light are pretty well equal, but in the shadows where the orange light doesn't hit, you get the darker blue. And then up in these shadows here, where the blue light doesn't hit, you can see actually the true value of the orange light. On the picture on the right, I wanted to simulate sunset or sunrise, that time of day when the sun is rising or falling where you get that warm light. So I actually used a gel on the light to give it that warm color. We can also tell from the shadows that the light source is fairly small, right, compared to the light, compared to the subject, because the shadows are pretty distinct. Not a lot of soft transition going from light to dark. Look up in here, if we go from true value to dark shadow fairly quickly, that also tells us that the light source must be fairly close to our subject. Because we've gone from true shadow or from true value to deep dark really quickly, we know the light source is close. And because we can see that there's a very distinct sharp shadow line, we know that the light itself was fairly small in relationship to the photograph. And the color, which is the topic of this particular slide, is warm, and I use that color to give the image a warm color. We also talked about how the size of light matters, as we've been discussing through these few different pictures. The picture on the left, I have obviously used a fairly large light source. The shadows are soft as you look around the picture. Also notice there's two specular highlights. We have a bright highlight here and a softer highlight here. In addition to the light source being larger than the subject and creating soft shadows, I still wanted to fill in those shadows a little bit, so I used a reflector card, which is causing the white or the lighter highlight here is also filling in that shadow. And you can see the effect of that a little bit. The white card was a little bit behind, so you can see the shadow coming up this way. But the main source light, which casts a little harder shadow, a little darker shadow, was over this way casting this shadow. For this industrial photograph over here, what I wanted to do was I really wanted to bring out the knurl in the bushing. Now, in order to do that, I needed a fairly small light source. So I used a small light source to really bring out the texture, to give those hard shadows. But by the same token, I didn't want the image to go completely dark on this side. So the light had to be fairly far away so that we still had some light over here, but also fairly small in relationship to really bring out the texture. This is also an example of using the angle of the light. The angle of the light is off to the side, it's not directly in front, so we can see the texture. Had I directly illuminated this instead of off to the right, as you can see from this highlight here, then we would have lost so much of this texture and it wouldn't have been as interesting a photograph. We also talked about how the distance from the light to the subject matters and how far the distance from the background is also matters. In the picture on the left, I used a large light, you can tell by the soft shadows, but it's also very far away from the subject because the shadows are not deep and dark. Also helped that it's glass and let the light shine through a little bit. But if we look over at the flower, we can also see that the transition from the true value of the flower on the right down into here into the shadow is not that dark. So the light had to be fairly far away, but it's also much bigger than the subject. So we have soft shadows, and that light effectively, as photographers like to describe it, kind of wraps around our subject. Now the product shot on the right, the diamond ring, was shot with a big light. It's bigger than the subject. We can tell because of the soft transition kind of between the true value here down into the dark shadows is a fairly slow transition. That's not a really sharp edge, but the light is fairly close to the subject. And we can tell that because when we get into that shadow, it is fairly dark really quick. So our light fall off was pretty fast in the short distance of this little ring. The light fell off fairly quickly. And you can see up in here, it just goes away to where there's no texture at all, where on this side here, we have the high specular highlights. Wow, we've really covered a lot in the last 30 to 45 minutes, whatever. And this is a subject I've been interested in all of my career in photography since the beginning, but I really started to get a good understanding of in the last couple of years as I studied from those other photographers I mentioned earlier. But I hope that distilling, a year's worth of study and hours worth of classroom and book reading hasn't, distilling it down into such a short program leaves you with enough curiosity to want to learn more, but also give you enough information to kind of fill in the blanks a little bit. So you have more tools in your bag when you go out with your camera. But I really want to thank the Pueblo City County Library District for one, encouraging this project. Megan, when she asked me to do a project on photography, I was really excited because this is the subject I've been interested in, so I was glad to be able to do it. But also they sponsored this program and the effort and the time it took to put into it, and I want to thank them for that. But we have a few minutes left. I tried to leave plenty of time, so if you have some questions, we can kind of go over them in the time we have left. So I'll turn it back to Megan, and she can facilitate a question and answer period. Hello. You know, light is really everything in photography.
Dave, thank you so much for that great presentation. And there's still time if you're watching right now to ask Dave questions. He's live. And if we don't get any questions, then I'm going to ask Dave my questions because I learned a lot and I still have some questions because I'm a novice photographer myself. So can I ask you my first question, Dave? Are you?
Oh, my camera stalled out. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can still hear you.
Okay, I don't know why it stalled out here, but
Well, at least you've got a smile on your face, so that
okay,
works.
well, yeah, go ahead, ask your first question. I'll try and reset this thing and see what happens.
Sure. I wanted to know when you discussed in the first part and you were talking about the green grass reflecting on the face, what do you normally use and how much to kind of counterbalance that reflection? I think you said it was a white cloth or diffuser. What do you use?
Well, it can be any number of things depending on the effect you want. I use like sometimes I'll just carry a white cloth or something. You can use the reflectors, like the window reflectors that you keep the sun out of your car, but they're silver and they give kind of a bright, harsher light. It's not quite as soft. You have a piece of poster board, something like that. It doesn't have to be huge, but again, the size of it will affect, sort of the quality of your picture. If it's too small, you're going to get, harder shadows and so on like that.
Do you try to have it big enough for the photograph that you want, or like how big do you make it, or just for the face?
It depends on what I'm trying to capture. It's usually it's something like that. If you're just trying to capture a face, it doesn't need to be that big. You just want to get some light under them to kind of lift up the shadows and so on like that. So
that's great. You also talked about in cameras, once you start editing, you can go back to your original settings in a RAW file, but not in a JPEG. How does that work? Is it through a program that you're editing through that you can go back to the original settings, or how does that work?
Yeah, first of all, when you shoot a JPEG, the camera says, I've got all this information, I think they want this or that, and then it shrinks it down to a smaller size. So you've automatically lost information as soon as it's converted to a JPEG. When you shoot in RAW, you can pull it into an editor, whether it's Photoshop or Capture One or GIMP. There's some free ones. I think it's called GIMP has one. I forget what it's called, but and then since you're dealing with the RAW file, which has all the information that the camera captured rather than the distilled information of a JPEG, you can say, well, I don't really like that color cast, and you can change the color tone and so on.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
That does. Thank you.
Okay.
And I think there's a question here that if you could take only one light modifier on a shoot, what would you bring? Softbox, beauty dish, umbrella? What modifiers do you find to be the most versatile?
Where are you shooting, indoors or outdoors?
It doesn't say.
If you're outdoors and you've got pretty good sun, a reflector or something like that, particularly if it's a reflector, it can also be a diffuser. So if the sun's really harsh over the person, you can put the diffuser between the sun and the person and soften that light that hits the person. Or if they have some color cast, you want to lift shadows, you can lay it down and just keep angling it until you get the light you want to make the face look the best it can be. So, but if you're shooting indoors, you're probably, unless you've got a strong window light, you probably would need a maybe a softbox or something like that, or a flash with a diffuser on it. You can fire a flash into that same diffuser you might use outside, and it'll spread that light out and make it much softer. But again, you lose a couple stops of light when you do that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Does that answer? I hope that answers the question. If not, we can re-ask it.
Yeah, it sounded like a good answer to me. I'm not quite as technical as you all. I mean, on that same topic with artificial light source, and I guess maybe it depends on what photograph you're taking. But what would you recommend, just if you're inside taking, one of your still lifes? What wattage do you want, or what would you use for an artificial light?
Well, it depends. Yeah, well, the cameras are pretty sensitive at low light, so if you don't have a lot, when I first started out, and actually up until a couple of years ago, I did everything with little flashlights. Right, get a can light from Lowe's and put in a spotlight in it, because I could set the exposure to adapt for the amount of light I had, as long as I didn't push the camera so much it got really noisy.
Okay.
I think the studio lights I have now are 60 watt or something. They're not huge.
Okay.
But I'm looking in how far away is the light? You lose a lot of light when it goes far away. So I shoot fairly close, so I don't need really big light times. If you're trying to light a car, you're shooting a car, you want a big light and big broad light, lots of power so you can get it back, and stuff like that. But,
that's great. I think that might be all the questions, unless there are any late questions coming in, or if there's anything else you wanted to add, Dave.
I don't think so. On one of my descriptions, I kind of stumbled around and probably got some things backwards, and I'm sorry for that. It was, in the conclusions, when I was talking about the picture with the apple can, and I was kind of stumbling all over myself. I might want to take some of that with a grain of salt.
Well, it was good advice, and a good starting point for all of us to start doing our own work.
Yeah, just keep your vision of your picture in mind. What do you want? If you don't want the hard shadows, then what are you going to do with your light? If you do want hard shadows but not deep shadows, what are you going to do with your light? The information's there, and it really amounts to practice, practice, practice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's great. Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you, and take some pictures. Have fun.
Right. Nice.
Night.